All right, welcome everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and I'm really excited to be beginning a new book with you. It's always fun when we start a new book, and today we're starting a book that I think is special in a lot of ways. It's called The Life of the Mind. First of all, it's a book Arendt never finished. She started it somewhere around 1970, gave a number of lectures on which it would be based, and then began writing it and imagined it to have three parts. The first part would be thinking, the second part on willing, and the last part on judging. Um, she did uh, give many lectures on the thinking part and wrote out the thinking part, and probably had a pretty good draft of it, although she would certainly have edited it more. The willing certainly had a draft of, but probably would have edited it quite a bit more. And then the judging part, she died with the title page in her typewriter in December of 1975. So, unfinished book, and yet we have a fair bit of it, and it has an interesting editorial history. As I said, it had never been finished. Um, her good friend and original executor and confidant, Mary McCarthy, took on the task of editing the book, um, and did, I think, a Herculean job, and published the book with parts one and part two on thinking and willing. Um, there are she certainly changed things and tried to make them more understandable in ways that some people, well, we've gotten used to. And yet, in the new critical edition of Arendt's work, which is coming out through the Wallstein Press, in both English and German, um, one of the things that they are trying to do is compare all the different manuscripts in all the different languages and try and see the differences, not to come up with a final version, but to allow us to see as much as we can the ways that Arendt, because Arendt often publishes, first of all, publishes almost all of her work in both English and German, often translating herself into German. And when she translates it into German, she often rewrites it. And so you can actually, it's not just seeing a translation, it's actually seeing her rethink it. And to read them together is actually quite useful. Um, and Obviously requires to some degree learning German or English, depending on which one you come from. But that is a useful and important uh, benefit of reading the critical edition, is that in many of these texts there is the English and German, and you get to see the differences. Now, in this text, there's not, because she never did translate it into German. Um, but in this text, the editors of the book, and so by the way, this is volume one of the critical edition. Volume 14 is The Life of the Mind, and it is in two editions, two volumes. The volume one is the text of The Life of the Mind, and also some additional texts at the end, which I'll refer to. Volume two is an appendix. It's long and it's scholarly, and I won't refer to it quite so much. There's also the original Harcourt Brace Johanovich book, The Life of the Mind, which I don't have my cover on mine anymore, but there it is. And we'll be able to refer to both as we go along. I will say that in the thinking section, which is the section that will occupy us for the next few months, I don't think that the changes are that major. I haven't sat there and gone through all of them. But if people come up with some and they want to discuss them, I'd be very happy to do so, and I hope you bring them up. I haven't approached this in a philological, scholarly sense, so I'm not sitting here looking for where a period or a comma was replaced or anything like that. That's not the approach we're going to use. We're going to try and read this book the way we read all the books that we read in this reading group, which is to understand Arendt's main philosophical, political, thoughtful effort, and in addition to that, understand why it matters in the world. Right, that's our general approach in this reading group, and we're not going to be any different. I am going to read the new edition as I teach this, and there are some gems in it, and that will allow me to add to things I've said about this book in the past, and I'm excited about that. And again, if you have questions that go to the scholarly apparatus, feel free to ask them. But I'm not going to focus on that as we go forward. Um, the book is well known to have two general epigraphs. One is by Cato, although it's taken from a passage in Cicero's book on the Republic or the Commonwealth. But and in this longer passage where Cicero is talking about what it means to, in a sense, be a gentleman and a scholar. He says at the very end of this passage that speaking of Cato, who writes of Cicero's grandfather Africanus, and said that Africanus never did more than when he did nothing, and was never less alone than when he was alone. Never did more than when he did nothing, and never was less alone than when he was alone. This, for those of you who know some Arendt, you'll recognize that this is a quote that Arendt uses at the very end of The Human Condition. And she explains why in the introduction to The Life of the Mind. We'll get there in a second, but in essence, The Life of the Mind was written. I'm sorry, the Human Condition was written in order to think through the Vita activa, which was her original title for it, and the Vita activa was understood against the Vita contemplativa, and so she said, look, the Vita contemplativa was this idea of a kind of restfulness, of contemplation, of being outside of action, and that was what traditionally had been seen as the core of what it meant to be human. And in The Human Condition, she said she wanted to retrieve the opposite of the Vita contemplativa, the Vita activa. But she says in doing so, I only looked at I saw the Vita contemplativa only negatively, right? I only looked at it as this idea of the opposite of action, as this place where there's contemplation and there's the quietude, and you think about the highest ideals. But there was another viewpoint which I realized one could take to understand thinking, or the Vita contemplativa. She calls it an altogether different viewpoint than the one she took in The Human Condition. And she says that she was always fascinated with this other viewpoint, and she left it out of The Human Condition because it didn't really fit. And she says that this quote from Cato that Cicero quotes represents this other viewpoint, that never is a man more active than when he does nothing, never is he less alone than when he is by himself. And this other viewpoint, right, is that there's something about stopping and doing nothing and being alone, where you're not simply alone or doing nothing, but you're in the highest realm of activity. What is it we do when we're alone by ourselves, doing nothing and thinking? What do we do when we think? What is the activity of thinking? Right? And that's what she's interested in in this book. Okay, why? Right. So if we think of Hannah Arendt and you think, oh, she wrote the book, the Vita Activa, or the Human Condition, and she said, we're not interested in contemplation, we're interested in action, because we're interested in man insofar as he forms a public life and is engaged in acting and speaking in public in ways that matter so that people pay attention and we build a common world. Isn't contemplation just me playing with my mind, thinking about God? Why is Arendt concerned with that? Right? Why is she now going to write a book at the end of her life, coming back to this idea of thinking or contemplating, which she has pushed away for the last 60 years of her life? And she tries to answer that in this book, but in the introduction to the first volume of the book on thinking. And that's what we're reading for today. There's another epigraph. By the way, there's also another epigraph to the book by Plato, right? Which is less talked about. It's from the Statesman, and it goes, every one of us is like a man who sees things in a dream and thinks that he knows them perfectly, and then wakes up to find that he knows nothing. I think the dream in which we think we know things perfectly is the dream of like speculative philosophy, that we somehow think we know the truth, that somehow we have access to some cognition that's real, and then we wake up to find that we know nothing. That finding that we know nothing is sort of the wonder that she'll call the beginning of philosophy, that she thinks Plato thinks is the beginning of philosophy. And yet there's also a wonder at realizing that philosophy will lead to nothing, and what happens after that. And that's actually where she's going in this book. The third epigraph, and I'm sorry to keep talking about epigraphs, but I think if Hannah Arendt puts an epigraph on top of a book, we should at least pay some attention to it, is from Martin Heidegger, and that's the epigraph to this section we're reading today on thinking, where Heidegger writes, and she's translating here from the German. He writes, thinking does not bring knowledge as do the sciences, right? Thinking doesn't give us scientific truth or knowledge. Thinking does not produce usable, practical wisdom, right? Thinking doesn't give us answers or tell us what to do. Thinking does not solve the riddles of the universe. I think same thing, we get that. Thinking does not endow us directly with the power to act, right? So this is Heidegger telling us all the things thinking does not do in a book he called, what is called Thinking, Was heißt Denken? And Arendt is certainly in agreement with Heidegger on all these points. So what does thinking do, and why would we concern ourselves with thinking? Okay, that's what this introduction is about, and I'm going to try and at least shed light on why Arendt is interested in this question. She begins by saying that there's a kind of presumption in her writing a book called The Life of the Mind, because she's not a philosopher. And she begins and says, I'm going to begin less with an apology for doing this than a justification. Now, I think she's using apology not in its traditional ancient sense, where apology is almost a justification, right? An apologia, but in the modern sense of a kind of admission of guilt. I apologize, I was wrong. She's not using it in that sense. She's going to say, let me justify why I'm writing this book. And I have to do so, she says, because I'm not a professional thinker. I'm not a philosopher. Now, you all know that in the Günter Gauss interview that she famously did on German TV in 1964 or late 63, he says, you're a philosopher. And she says, no, I have to correct you. I'm not a philosopher. I'm I'm a political theorist or a thinker. And he says, well, I'm going to call you a philosopher. And she goes, well, you can do what you want, but I'm not. Um, and what does she mean by that, right? The obvious answer is simple. She never got a degree in philosophy. Um, she doesn't think of herself as a philosopher. She doesn't write about the history of being in the way that traditional philosophers have, or metaphysics. And so she doesn't think of herself as a philosopher. But I think the broader and more important answer to that question is that um, she always writes focused on the world, on appearances, on what is, right? Whether she's writing about totalitarianism, right? She wants to know, what is totalitarianism as a worldly phenomenon? What is education? We talked last week about artificial intelligence and the space race and the exploration of space. What does it mean that artificial intelligence or the space race is happening? She's engaged in the world. She's not interested in an eternal world and of ideas, of a super sensible world. She's not interested in the truth as opposed to appearances. She always thinks through appearances. Um, and thus she's not a philosopher in her mind. She's not she's actually concerned with what is, not what ought to be. And that's essential to who she is. And so she says, given that I've always been um interested in what is, and the world as it is, and the world of appearances, why should I write a book called The Life of the Mind? And she says there were two reasons, two provocations. One I already spoke about, right, which is that uh, she says that in the human condition, she had thought about action and contemplation, and had sort of left thinking out, because she was interested in action, but she realized that there was another view of thinking as active, that she was leaving out, and she ends the book with this quote from Cato to mark that. Um, but there's a second reason that she brings up, that she spends a lot more time on here, which is that in 1961 she goes and she observes the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and then in 1963 publishes the book Eichmann in Jerusalem. And she is struck both by Eichmann and by the reaction to the book. Um, uh, she's struck by Eichmann's thoughtlessness, she says. She says that the banality of evil, which she mentions once, if you'll recall, at the end of the book, at the very last line of the book before the epilogue, and she doesn't even call it just the banality of evil. She never says banality of evil. She says the word and thought defying banality of evil, right? Which is a much richer articulation of what the banality of evil means than simply calling it the banality of evil. She says the word and thought defying banality of evil was not a theory or a doctrine. She says it was something quite factual, right? Something she said before. What she meant by it, she says, was that Eichmann was shallow, right? While the deeds he did were evil and monstrous, he as a person was not. And I think there's a number of misunderstandings in the banality of evil idea that many people have. And one is that Arendt doesn't think that there's evil. Of course, there's evil, there's banality of evil, but there's also still evil. There's still evil deeds, there's monstrous deeds. Those deeds aren't shallow, they're monstrous, right? She doesn't contest that. What she's saying is that Eichmann himself was not a monster. Um, he wasn't Satan, a lightning fall from heaven. He wasn't Lucifer, a fallen angel. He wasn't acting out of this incredible pride, of which she says only the best are capable, right? The people who think of themselves as true heroes who can do the best, and in the attempt to do the best, do the worst. And that's how Hegel understands evil when he says that the greatest good always conceals itself. I'm sorry, got it wrong. Hegel says the greatest evil always conceals itself as the greatest good. It's in the attempt to do great good that the great people do great evil, right? And that's an essential insight. And she says Eichmann was not that. He was not trying to do great good, and in doing so, got he got misguided and went and did evil. She thinks he was just an average guy doing his job. He also wasn't weak like Macbeth. He wasn't driven out of hatred like Claggart in Billy Budd, in Melville's Billy Budd. And he wasn't covetous, which is often thought to be the root of all evils. Eichmann himself, as a doer, she thinks, was quite ordinary, neither demonic nor monstrous. He was without firm ideological convictions, without base motives. He wasn't stupid but thoughtless. And as we talked about when we read the Eichmann book about a year ago in this group, even, there's this argument that some people have made, like Bettina Stangneth, who says that she gets Eichmann wrong and that he was an ideological Nazi and things like that. And I think, again, at least as I presented it, and you don't have to always agree with me, but I think Stangneth is simply wrong about that. And Arendt, I think does get Eichmann right. And we talked about the Stangneth book at the end of our reading of Eichmann, and happy to, and you can go back and listen to that on the podcast or on YouTube if you'd like. In any case, for Arendt, what strikes her about Eichmann was that he could only function in a bureaucracy with procedures, whether it was the Nazi bureaucracy or the Israeli court bureaucracy. He was happy in both those situations. But as soon as procedures were absent, when they asked questions that he couldn't find a procedural answer to, he was completely confused and helpless, and he falls back on cliches, standardized codes of expression, as she puts it in the book, and conduct that have the socially recognized function of protecting us against reality, against the claim on our thinking attention. He couldn't think. He could operate according to procedures, but when he was asked to do something outside of them, he protected himself against reality, against thinking, and he did so with cliches and things like that. And so she's struck by this absence of thinking in Eichmann. The man who was helped to do the greatest, most horrendous evil deeds of the 20th century was not a monster. He was ordinary and thoughtless. And she says this brought a question to her mind, right? Is evil doing, whether it's the sins of omission or sins of commission, right? Whether you don't stop evil or whether you actively do evil, is it possible is it possible in the absence not only of base motives but of any motives? Can you do evil out of thoughtlessness, right? And that's the question that she is struck by when she reads Eichmann. And she says on the factual level, it was this absence of thinking, which is so ordinary and experienced in our everyday life, where we hardly have the time, let alone the inclination, to stop and think, that aroused her interest. Okay, the absence of thinking. But what is thinking? And that's where this book comes from. She says, could it be that the activity of thinking as such, this is on page 5 in the old book, and I think page 17 or 18, 18 or 19 in the new book, could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining whatever happens to come to pass or to attract attention, regardless of results and specific content, could just the activity of thinking, not where it goes, right? Because we're told, Heidegger tells us in the epigraph that we read that thinking doesn't bring knowledge, doesn't produce results, doesn't solve the riddles, doesn't tell us how to act. But could this activity of thinking as such, whatever that means, the habit of examining whatever happens, right, regardless of results or content, could this activity be among the conditions that make men abstain from evil doing, or even actually condition them against it? Not that thinking could produce results, not that virtue can be taught, she says, because only habits and customs can be taught, not virtue. And importantly, and habits can be taught, but we're learning very quickly how easily it is for habits and norms to be undone, right? I mean, we're seeing that before our eyes in much of the world today. if morality is simply not a truth, but comes from habits and mores, from customs, from ethics, from ethos, from the way we behave, well, as soon as there are new models for behavior and we replace one kind of good with another kind of good, in the way people act, morality transforms overnight. She witnessed that in the 1920s and 30s. We're witnessing a transformation of morality right now, in much of the world, not just in the United States. Um, and so she says that Eichmann's thoughtlessness is not from a lack of customs or morals or ethics. Um, it had to do with that he embraced new customs and morals and ethics. And so she's asking this question, if thoughtlessness, this thoughtless um, inability to face reality, is what could lead someone like Eichmann to become one of the greatest evildoers of the 20th century. Well, what is thinking? Obviously, with the intent of thinking, how do we uh, encourage thinking in a way that might be able to um, slow down, if not even prevent, the rise of evil in the world? So these are the two justifications that she offers for engaging in this project, right? So that the inquiry into thinking actually is not a philosophical inquiry, or is not generated by a philosophical inquiry. It's generated by a political inquiry, namely, can thinking actually have political impact? And she's going to be very skeptical of that, right? Because the way this book works is to say, thinking, in order to examine thinking, we have to look back at a history of thinking. And that means at philosophers and metaphysicians. And if we look back at philosophers and metaphysicians, we realize that one of the things that they think of is that thinking takes us out of the world, right? That thinking for them is contemplation of God or of truth absent the world. And they think that thinking is not supposed to have political consequences. And she's going to call that a fallacy, right? But she's also going to say that these fallacies are real and they have truth to them, and we have to um, focus on and think about these truths. So she begins and says that philosophical and metaphysical questions um, have been rejected in the modern age, right? Starting with Hegel and then Nietzsche, who said God was dead, and then certainly with Husserl, who said back to the phenomena themselves, the first great phenomenologist, and said we should stop talking about philosophical concepts and go back to the phenomena. And then certainly with Heidegger, who said that we have to um, uh, go back to the phenomena himself, following Husserl, um, and really think outside of the tradition in many ways and destroy the tradition. Um, uh, and so she says, well, okay, what is dead? What do these philosophers, these post metaphysical philosophers accomplish? What do they kill? And she says that one thing they kill is the two world idea, the idea that there's a world of philosophical truth, which is super sensible, right? And appearances, which are the sensible. Um, go back to Plato's cave analogy, which I think many of you probably know or have read. Um, most of us are sitting in front of the cave and we see shadows, we see appearances. And Plato says one of us frees ourselves, gets out of the chains, climbs up out, and sees in the light of ideas and the sun of the ideas the truth. And then has to go back into the cave and gets killed because he tells people what you're seeing is untrue and they don't like that. But the point is that philosophy begins with this idea that there's a supersensible world, which is eternal and true, and then there's the world of appearances, which is untrue. Um, and that there's a discrepancy between the world of truth and the world of reality, between words and thought. In fact, that all these great thinkers say that there's no way to express the truth in words. The truth is unsayable, beyond words. And this is what leads to metaphysics. It's the attempt to think what is unsayable. And such thinking, she said, discriminates against appearances, just as modern science, which is the continuation of metaphysics, discriminates against thought. Arendt says that it is not desirable to return to metaphysics. She says this in the new volume of the critical edition on page 21, right? She says, look, metaphysics is dead. We don't want to return to metaphysics. And in the death of metaphysics, she says, what's come to an end is this basic distinction between the sensual and the supersensual. The idea that the unsensible is more real and more true than the sensible. But it's not just that the unseen is what's dead. The very distinction between the sensible and the unsensible is now dead. And this raises the question of nihilism, right? If we get rid of not only the true world, but also the world of appearances, haven't we gotten rid of the world? Haven't we just negated the world? And she says, yes, insofar as the death of the distinction between the unseen world and the world of appearances, the true world and the world of appearances, means that we lose both worlds. She says that on page 22. And she quotes a very famous passage by Friedrich Nietzsche from How the World Became a Fable, where he says, we've abolished the true world. What has remained? The apparent one, perhaps? Oh, no. With the true world, we have also abolished the apparent one. And so she takes this seriously, and she says that the death of God, the death of metaphysics, the death of philosophy is now obvious to us, but it has consequences. It has political consequences, right? In that we now no longer believe in a kind of morality. Like there's no Christian morality. There's no, you can't say that morals are true because we no longer believe in a true world. And so you're going to have political consequences of the death of metaphysics and morality, nihilism. But she says we're not concerned with that in this book, right? Although it's something she'll come back to at times because it's a meaningful worry. She says what we're concerned with in this book is the ability to think at all, right? If thinking throughout the entire history of the tradition of thought has been thinking outside of the appearances, separating ourselves from the world and thinking the truth in contradistinction to what appears. Well, if the distinction between truth and appearance has been erased, what do we think about when we're thinking? How can we think, which is supposed to take us out of the world, if the difference between in the world and out of the world has been eliminated? And so she says that in talking about nihilism and the death of metaphysics, we often fall right back into it, and we, in a sense, end up being metaphysicians again. We don't take seriously the radical nature of the break in the tradition, right? And she says we have to do that. We have to realize that none of the old metaphysical fallacies are convincing today. And so we can't just fall back into them. At the same point, at the same time, however, and this is the big however, she says none of the metaphysical fallacies are arbitrary, and we can't simply dismiss them as nonsense. This is, I think, one of the fascinating moves in this book, right? On the one hand, we have to not fall prey to these metaphysical. We can't think that thinking means thinking truth and not appearances. We have to accept that we don't know where we are when we think anymore. It's not that we can't keep saying, oh, well, the metaphysical fallacies don't work, but we still think when we're not in appearances. You can't do that. And so she says on page 23 in the new volume, the metaphysical fallacies, on the contrary, contain the only clues we possess to what thinking means to those who engage in it. Namely, we have to engage with these metaphysical fallacies. And not because we think they're right and not to fall prey to them, but because they teach us something essential about thinking. We need to pursue thinking through these fallacies and through metaphysics, and yet we have to do so in a new way. And she cites a line that she's used before, actually in the last book we read, in the preface to Between Past and Future, where she says, our heritage was left to us by no testament, by a line by Rene Char. And she says we have to be able to look at the past with new eyes. We have to look back at these metaphysical fallacies, at thinking, but not get caught up in them without believing them. And so this brings her to the final part of this introduction, where she says, all right, well, what is the activity of thinking, right? What do we do when we think? And she says, okay, well, all metaphysics, which is how we've typically thought of thinking, asks us to separate ourselves from the world of appearances and put ourselves in a true world, so that when we think, we are invisible in the world of appearances. We withdraw from appearances. Since the beginning of philosophy, the philosopher withdraws from appearances and lives in the region of the few, right? We're the friends of the gods. In a speech given on this topic in the 1970s, that's a little different from what made it into the final book. She looks at this. She goes into this a little bit more in depth. This is on page 398 to 399 in this volume. It's part of the additional texts of this volume, and she says that to philosophize, or to philosophein in the Greek, right? Is it as an activity, actually didn't begin with philosophers. It began with a historian named Herodotus. And the person he was talking about was Solon, the Greek statesman, the Athenian statesman. And Herodotus used the word to philosophize to describe Solon, in meaning that he was against the sophists, against the people who thought badly, and he, sought to think well. Similarly, she says that our word, and so she says the origin of the word philosophy doesn't actually begin with philosophy or philosophers. It begins with a statesman, interestingly enough. And she says something similar about the word metaphysics, which had nothing to do with simply the fact that Aristotle wrote a number of treatises on the physical world, and then also had written a number of treatises on the on theology, and that looked into the ineffable or the unsayable. And when people in the Middle Ages arranged his books, they put the theology after the physics, and it was called the metaphysica, the books beyond the physical books, the natural books, and it was an accidental term. Her point with both of these is that thinking existed before the emergence of specialized disciplines, right? It began with a kind of wonder and puzzlement about the world. And yet she's saying once it gets caught up in philosophy, it gets trapped. And the person she thinks who explores this trap of philosophical thinking and names it more than anyone else is Immanuel Kant, who distinguished between what he called Vernunft and Verstand. Vernunft we typically translate as reason, although what it really means is the intensification of thinking with our mind. Vernunft. The Ver is intensification, and Nunft is from the German, the Greek neuen, to sort of think with our mind. And so Vernunft is an intensification of thinking with our mind, versus Verstand, which is an intensification of standing there, being there in the world. And so she says we accept this distinction today. Um, uh, in the sense that Vernunft has come to mean reason and meaning and thinking, and Verstand has come to mean intellect or truth and cognition or knowing, right? So she makes an opposition between reason and intellect, between meaning and truth, and between thinking and knowing. And for her, our human mind, right, cannot have verifiable knowledge of the mysteries of the universe. That's what Kant said as well, right? We can't know about God, freedom, and immortality in a way of cognition through our intellect. We can't know it. We have to sense it in a sense. And Kant says, therefore, though that kind of knowledge is pursued by Vernunft, by reason, by meaning and thinking, not by knowing or cognition. The urgent need of reason she says, is different from the mere quest and desire for knowledge. There's a need to know, there's a need to know the world, but there's also an urgent need of reason to sort of think and get meaning that is not in the world. Kant, she says, wrongly held to reason as the desire to know what you cannot be proved, to know the unknowable. And the critique of pure reason is a saying that there's a limit to what we can know. We can't know it, and that's a problem. Arendt here differs from Kant and says that thinking is not knowing. Thinking is the pursuit of meaning. And thus, thinking, she says, also is not limited to the ineffable, to God and the soul and some supersensible truth, but we also can think about the world we live in, the everyday world. And so she says on page 25, thinking applies also to things of this world. Man's need to reflect, to think, encompasses nearly everything that happens to him. We need to think about the political world, the world of appearances, not just God, not just some ineffable truth. And so she says Kant, while he made room for thinking about God and for certain, non-empirical truths, he actually separated thinking from the world. And his successors as well, they sought to achieve true knowledge of the world, cognition. They demanded a kind of result, she says, right, that applied the criteria of truth to all knowing. And contra Kant now, Arendt says that we have to understand thinking fully different from cognition, fully different from from the effort to understand in the sense of Verstand. And what this means, and this is the key, this is the nut that you have to understand here. And it's basically this one sentence on page 26 here, that our entire, next year is going to be an attempt to understand, right? Which is that the need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. And truth and meaning are not the same, right? You should memorize this. This is one of the most important lines in all of Arendt, and trying to make sense of it is not easy. The need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but for the quest for meaning. Okay, what does that mean? Right? She says that the quest for meaning seems unnatural to us. This is actually, I'm taking this from a later essay that's in the additional texts in this volume, but I think it's helpful. The quest for meaning can seem unnatural. When we stop and think, and we stop knowing or doing, it seems contrary to the human action. The humans, most of us want to do. We want to act in the world, right? One of the great images of thinking that Arendt will highlight for us, but is one of the classic images in all of Western literature, is the image of Socrates on his way to the symposium in Plato's Symposium, where he just stops in the middle of the street and thinks for hours with his daemon on his shoulder, the daemon who makes him stop and think when he's potentially doing something he should not do. That's unnatural. Very few people stop and sit in the middle of the street for hours thinking. Thinking, she says, is extraordinary. It's out of order. And thus thinking is at war with common sense. And one thing we should all know is that Arendt is a thinker of common sense, right? So that if thinking is at war with common sense, thinking in a very important way is not about truth. And it's not about doing in the world, and it's not about acting in the world. Well, what is it about? Well, she thinks it's about meaning. Well, what does that mean? She gives a couple of examples. She says, when you say a triangle laughs, that is not untrue. It is meaningless, right? It's silly to say that that's an untrue statement or a true statement, but it's not a meaningful statement. What does it mean a triangle laughs? But when St. Anselm says that there is a proof of God, which says that um, all perfect beings exist. God is a perfect being, therefore God exists. She says Kant showed that that's not true as a logical statement. There's a fallacy there. The fallacy being that to predicate um, uh, uh, existence of being is wrong, right? So it's not a true statement, but she says it's a meaningful statement. Um, for Plato, she says that in thinking is a discourse I carry on with myself to prepare my eye to see the truth. For Christians, she says, meditations end in contemplation, which gives me a blessed state of the soul where the mind no longer stretches out to see the truth of the world, but stretches out in anticipation of a future state given an intuition. And in the modern age, she says, thinking is now a handmaiden of science, and mathematics, the non empirical science where the mind plays with itself, prepares the mind to know the laws of the universe. And Hobbes thought that by reckoning with the consequences of math, we could deliver true knowledge about God and the soul and such things. She says that Kant destroyed this illusion, right? He showed us that thinking will never lead to truth. Positivists respond to that and say, therefore, we should stop philosophizing or stop thinking, and we should simply study the world positivistically. Arendt is here making a claim that we should still think, even though thinking is not going to provide us any truth, because thinking is about the quest for meaning, and that somehow the quest for meaning, if I am putting the dots together correctly, right? The quest for meaning protects us from shallowness, protects us from thoughtfulness. Somehow the activity of thinking and seeking meaning brings depth to each of us who engage in it in such a way that we don't get caught up in movements, don't get caught up in shallowness, and therefore might be inoculated in some way against evil. That's the impetus, I think, for writing this book, The Life of the Mind. And the first section, which will be on thinking, which we'll get into starting next week. But that's the introduction of the book and how she's thinking about it. So I will stop there. I am, as I said, happy to take all sorts of questions, whether they're philological or substantive or anything like that. And I look forward to the conversation. Uh, there's an active conversation going in the chat, which I will not be monitoring, but you can, and please be respectful of each other. And then the other way to engage in the conversation is by going to the react button and raising your hand. And I see some of you already done that. And I will call on people in the order that the hands are up, and I look forward to the conversation. All right, John Holt, you're up first.
Thank you, Roger. On thinking, I want to go back to Eichmann in Jerusalem when she talked about Eichmann's thoughtlessness. And she characterized his inability to think or his thoughtlessness as related to his inability to imagine the world from somebody else's point of view, anybody else's point of view. And that seems to me to be a failure of imagination, what I would call the moral imagination. So it would seem to be essential for the ability to think in Arendt's sense
Yeah,
to have this moral imagination. Does that make sense?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean,
It clarifies it for me.
yeah, I mean the last chapter of the thinking book, which is on judgment, sort of a precursor, will bring us into the question of the imagination. And certainly the moral imagination is, if you read, so we have read in this reading group together Kant's lectures on judgment, which again, I'm sorry, Arendt's lectures on Kant and judgment, Kant's political philosophy, um, which many people have suggested would have been the foundation of volume 3 of this book on thinking, willing, and judgment. Um, there's many. She's written a number of things in her career about judgment, and so there's been a uh, wide ranging industry of people trying to say, here's what Hannah Arendt would have written on judgment if she had not died on December 4th, 1975, with judgment, with the title page in the typewriter. Um, but a big part of her thinking about judgment is the moral imagination, um, the imagination of a public community, uh, in which I take my judgment and I test it against my imagination of other people's judgments who disagree with me. And in doing so, I don't get the right answer, because there is no right answer. We're post metaphysical, but I broaden my perspective. I widen my way of thinking. It's what she calls an erweiterte Denkensart, a widening of my way of thinking. And I open myself to a public thought that is comprised of um, a wider uh, a wider sense of the public than I could be just out of my perspective, or me and my friends, or my fellow Arendtians and fellow academics or fellow New Yorkers. And in doing so, through that imagination of a wider community, I test my thoughts against them, and I try and um, rephrase or revise my thoughts, not to agree with people I disagree with, and not to hold on to my view, but to try and find for me what I think would be a common truth that I could persuade, or as she calls it, woo others to, in order to um, build together a world we share, or a common world. And that's how we're going to read more about judgment as we get through this book, but that is a way in which she imagines the imagination as part of the act of judgment. Okay. Connor.
Hey, this is my first call, so it's great to be with you, and apologies for the noise in the background.
It's
I just
welcome, Connor. It's great to have you.
Thank you. I'm sort of, wrestling with the meaning, truth, distinction, and thinking about some of your videos I've watched about the human condition, and talking about the things experts can and can't tell us. Is that a sort of a useful analogy to start with as I think about the meaning, truth, distinction, or is that kind of a separate topic?
So, um, I mean, it's a nice question. So here, right, as I said, she says there's a political dimension to the question um of nihilism and the end of metaphysics, and then there's a philosophical dimension to it. She says here in this book, in this book, we're not going to engage in the political, because this is a book of thinking. Um, on a philosophical level, right, the distinction is, or the problem is that uh the very distinction between a true world of appearances, of a true world outside of the world of appearances, and a I'm sorry, yeah, a true world of appearances and a appearing world that's not true and that's unreliable breaks down. You know, okay, well, then what is thinking? And she says, well, thinking is not about truth, it's about meaning. Um, Now, okay, well, what about truth, right? What is truth? And what and this is the problem of nihilism, right? That she brings up here and says it's a real problem. And the problem is that in the political world, right? If you want to say this is the truth, you don't have a metaphysicals to back you up anymore. So, if you're a scientist, let's just pick one example, and you want to say, um, you know, uh, um, you know, the Earth is warming because of human activity, right? It's a fairly common scientific claim, right? Um, you can say that, and you can have an entire scientific community back you up. But when someone says to you, well, I disagree, and you say, well, look at the science, and they say, well, first of all, why should I believe? I mean, we could contest the science, right? We can say, well, I don't agree with your things or whatever. But someone can simply say, why should I believe in science? And then the scientist is like, I don't know, because it works. And they're like, well, I don't think it's working very well for me. People are still getting sick, and scientists make mistakes and all this stuff. And the point is that science is based on a metaphysics, right? The metaphysics of science says that there's a reason for everything in the universe. Nothing is without a reason. It's the first principle of science that Leibniz articulated, the principium rationis, or the principle of sufficient reason. And if someone says to you, well, I simply don't believe that nothing is without a reason. God makes things without reasons. God is all powerful. Um, there are, or I don't believe in God, and the world is full of chaos. And why should I believe that everything has a reason? Um, you know, this is the problem we're in, is that uh, if you believe that God is dead and metaphysics is dead, once someone raises that fundamental question, we're at an impasse. Um, and so, I mean, I happened to note just the other day that the FDA canceled the meeting that was to determine the flu vaccine for next year. Like every year, the leading flu scientists and virologists come together and they decide, around the world, and they decide what are the strains of the flu that are going to be active next year, and they develop a vaccine to attack those strains of the flu for next year. They canceled the meeting. Um, there's a fundamental sense, I think, of many people coming to power today that science is unreliable, that science doesn't work. And, um, you know, if that's the case, why should we privilege scientists, right? There's all sorts of other knowledges out there. There's scientific knowledge, but there's also practical knowledge, and there's knowledge of people who, work in clinics, who don't have degrees, but whatever. And then there's knowledge of people who, um, you know, study yoga or something else, and think that there are better ways to heal us than through modern science. Um, and and if you've reached a point where there's no truth, right, in the political world, uh then it's a question of how you develop that truth. um and I think the problem that Arendt is here in engaging in, right, she's saying in this book we're not going to really talk about that political problem. um but the problem is there. What she's trying to say in this book is that thinking should not come under the reign of truth. Thinking is beyond the question of truth. Um, and so we have to free ourselves both from a metaphysics that privileges truth over appearance, um, Uh, and also, I think even from the very distinction between truth and appearance. Um, Now, yeah, I mean, you're right, Connor, to raise that question, because if you accept that, right, there is the problem of nihilism, and she confronts that. She says that's not what this book is about. She's written plenty of other books about that, and and she thinks that the problem of determining truth is maybe the most important problem of the modern era. And we just talked about the essay Truth and Politics a few weeks ago in this reading group, where she says that you can live without justice, but you can't live without truth. And yet, there is no truth in politics. And so the challenge of politics today is to develop non political authorities that can establish truth, even when we know that truth doesn't exist. That's the challenge. In education, she says in the essay, The Crisis of Education, education needs authority. And yet we live in a world without authority. And so we have to, in a sense, create an authority that doesn't exist in order to educate our kids. So politically, she struggles her entire writing life with this problem that politics needs truth, and yet there is no truth. And so, how do we mold authority? How do we mold truth? And the answer is through, as John was saying, through this idea of a moral imagination that we learn to share through talking with each other and with ourselves, where we try and think publicly instead of just individually. So yeah, I mean, it all goes together. We're not in this book per se going to engage in the political question, because we're more engaged in the thinking question. And yet the question of thinking about meaning has a political power only when the world, she says, has gone so far down a thoughtless road, right? Like in times of ideological contamination, that everyone has stopped thinking. At which point, the person who thinks stands out in a way and reprimands the world for its thoughtlessness and can have an impact, political impact. And that's as close as we're going to get to politics in this book. But it's an important and I think increasingly relevant activity in our world. Hey, I think it's Haley. I'm having trouble seeing because of the sun, and I apologize. Haley?
Yes, Haley. Yeah,
Yes.
hi, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you.
I haven't read this book. It's my first time reading this book, but I've read The Human Condition. I'm studying the human condition. And I am just really interested in the link that Arendt makes between action, so acting politically, and thinking. And she says in The Human Condition how we act as a way to discover who we are, and we find out who we are, we get a better sense of who we are when we act with others. And I'm just really interested in thinking then about how thinking then and then reflecting on how your action is responded to by the people around you, how that forms part of that continuing boundlessness of your action. And so and now I'm not sure now what you might think of thinking in terms of also helping you to discover who you are, and is that part of that forming that empathy and forming that moral imagination and being able to step into other people's shoes and that. And I don't know if that makes sense. I'm so excited to read this book.
Great, Haley. Thanks and welcome. It's a great question. So yes, you're right to say that action, I mean, which obviously has a very rich and complicated idea of action, which is connected to freedom, but is also connected to an act of self-revelation, right? Insofar as we act, we appear, and others see us, and in that interaction, stories are told about us, and we become who we are, which is not always based on who we think we are, but also based on who others think we are. Thinking, right? Again, we're going to delve into these fallacies of thinking. And the first fallacy is that when we think, we exit the public world. But it's a fallacy. We have to recognize that, and yet it's a fallacy that can teach us something. And so, but thinking also for her in this book is not going to be, pure contemplation out in, in the wilderness. It's going to be an activity, right? I'm never more, less alone than when I'm alone. And that goes back to this question that John started us with, the moral imagination, or the judging imagination, where in my imagination, insofar as I think and then begin to judge, I bring different people and different views and different perspectives into my own. And so there's an activity of thinking, and that's the key thing. That's one of the keys that you have to keep thinking about here. Thinking is an activity, as she understands it. It's not simply it's not just, it's not pure quietude. It's it's got work to it. It's got action in it. As she's going to develop it. And it's not geared towards truth, it's geared towards meaning. It's still generally outside the world, right? I mean, when we think, we're still usually by ourselves, and yet, and she'll stick to that, except in rare circumstances, and those circumstances are when she says, the rest of the world completely stops thinking, and when that happens, us thinking seems strange and makes people pay attention to us, as if thinking now were a public action. And at that point, our thinking can actually impact the world. But that's really the limit case of thinking acting in the world. But yes, insofar as thinking itself is about the pursuit of meaning, right? And again, I'm well aware that meaning is a complicated and vague idea, right? As I said earlier, it's out of order. It seems unnatural to us. What is this meaning? Um, you know, uh, she says, not a triangle laughs, that's meaningless, but a proof of God could be meaningful. Does that matter to us? I mean, and if you want to think about it also in terms of her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, right? So much of how she understands the origins of totalitarianism, Haley, is through the rise of loneliness, modern mass loneliness. And insofar as, we live in a world of loneliness, we live in a world of atomization. We live in a world in which the traditions that give our lives meaning have broken down. The break in tradition, whether it's religion or family or a people, whatever it is, and she says there's something deeply human about the need for those traditions and those meanings, those worlds, and so yeah, I think that the interest in thinking is about, in a very important way, who we are. A question that she thinks we have to ask as human beings. We have to belong to something. Now, one way you can belong is by not thinking and just go along with the crowd. But you can also belong by thinking and building a world that you share with others that's a thoughtful, meaningful world. And obviously, that's where she's headed. The question is, to what extent that kind of thinking, which reaches out and builds a public world, can inoculate us against going along with the crowd and and doing evil. And that's the ultimate interest of the book.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Rachel.
Hi, thank you for reading this book. It's wonderful to be back. I used to participate, and a year ago I did give a presentation to the feminist group on Hannah Arendt's theory of judgment, which I believe I've reconstructed among many others. And I just want to say that I feel like it's so monumentous and important to be thinking about this book right now, because I think we're in a revolutionary period, and it's obviously a period that a lot of people are pretty stressed out about. I have to say, I'm one of those, people who actually feels relieved that things are in this kind of revolutionary period. And I just spoke at the local city council against noise ordinances because it seems to me that teenage kids should be able to have a space in which they can express their relationship to transcendence in a garage band or doing whatever they want. And a lot of what's been happening in the public schools has been indoctrination and propaganda, and even kind of behavioral modification experiments that have been conducted in a non-consensual way. And so I think that I would encourage Roger and all of us to consider that there might be a more populist way to read the life of the mind. And I think that she says in this introductory chapter that we have to assume that all people are able to think, and that is really a response to the question of political authority, and the question of the death of God and the end of metaphysics is a question of political authority. And I think that the politics is throughout this, and it's very timely for the present. In terms of meaning and how we think about this, I think we might have to quibble a little bit about, or maybe we could say something more. As we read it, we will discover that if you read it from more of a Heideggerian perspective as opposed to analytic perspective, that you will consider that the meaning stuff is stuff that the ordinary people, the people who are listening to podcasts and just talking, shooting the shit, actually care about. And what Anselm is about, and I think Kant's essay on the copula gets to this, Heidegger points this out, is that and I think this is how Arendt takes it, is that the point of the proof of the existence of God is the experience of being. Right? It's really not an epistemological question. It's an experiential, phenomenological question. Like, you either experience the unity of being, like a romantic or a literary poet, or you don't. And so the question of I think that I would just encourage us to read this as to read the political in terms of within a Heideggerian flexion, that if you have this rich experience of being, that is it. She's going to say this in a later chapter, that there's basically two ways to go. You either take the Sartre way or you take the Heidegger way. You're either you look around and you see nothing, like he sees in Nausea, like a bunch of stuff that's disaggregate material that has no reason to exist, and that's the reason why it needs metaphysics. But for other people who see nature and beauty and wonder and feel themselves in harmony with the other creatures, they don't need a cause for other things to exist, so they're not motivated by metaphysics. And so there's I think that's still the reality of the world that we live in, and the ordinary common people are aware of this, and they have been talking about things. And for that reason, us elite educated people need to respect that there's already an Arendtian formation of opinion coming up, and we need to guard ourselves in terms of turning Arendt into a project of cultivating expertise, because I think she would think we were making fools of ourselves, or engaging in some kind of fallacy.
All right. Welcome back, Rachel. Thanks for coming. I think, if I don't know what you've remember of what we've done, or what what we've done, but I don't think anyone's going to accuse me of siding Arendt with the experts. I happen to agree fundamentally with you that Arendt is a thinker deeply skeptical of experts and expertise, at least politically. She thinks expertise and knowledge as an authority outside of politics is essential. That said, there can be expertise by non-trained experts. I mean, one of the problems we have in general in our world is that you know, we have a particular view of experts, right? Which is that they're people who have studied something, whether it's economics or virology or environmentalism or farming. And we often discount the knowledge of people who farm or are regular doctors who treat diseases or people who live in the woods and understand the way rivers and trees and things work.
I
And so
think when
there's
we get the corporate capture out of the expertise, then we'll have a new ground to talk about. And what the ordinary people are saying is, we're not against science. We're for science. We're worried about the corporate capture, you know?
okay. Thank you. Yeah, look, I'm trying to, I think there's, always an important point in in raising these questions. Um, Arendt herself is is certainly someone who believes deeply in common sense, right? And yet that doesn't mean that common sense is always thoughtful. And one shouldn't ignore common sense, but one shouldn't either put it up on a pedestal. And one has to look at it from both sides. So I think that you're right that there is a way that those who privilege uh, a kind of educated elite expertise often ignore the knowledge of the everyday person, and yet someone who won't also listen to or acknowledge knowledge that people who have studied things is also one-sided. And I think that unfortunately right now we're in a, as in many parts of our politics and our world, it's an either or for most people. Um, and instead of trying to think and extract ourselves from both the sort of tyranny of expertise and the tyranny of common sense and find a public world that we can share. Both sides have politicized this to such a degree that they almost refuse to listen to the other, and that's the danger that we're in today, or at least one of the many dangers that we're in today. But we'll come back to this, especially when we read the sections on common sense in here and the war between science and common sense, which is one of some of the more interesting passages in this volume on thinking. So we'll come back to that. All right. Thank you very much, Rachel. Uh, Will.
Right. I have two. I'm sorry, I don't have my face showing. I don't know how to work the computer, but I have two questions that are related, and that is this idea of thinking where there's an absence of banisters, uh, of intellectual standards and guidelines as to how we should act? And if so, when she talks about meaning, is she suggesting that we really need a different type of language, a different understanding of language than that of signifying designated rules and objects?
So yes, I mean, there's no doubt that um, the kind of thinking she's talking about is related to what she calls um, uh, thinking without banisters. Um, the banisters that we've traditionally had are the tradition, religion, family, uh, you know, peoples, history. And the premise of her work from the late 50s and through the 70s is the break in tradition and the way that those banisters have been destroyed. And the question is, now we have to think anew. We have to think with new eyes on the past. She doesn't want to just throw out the past, right? But she wants to think through the past with new eyes, and that's what she's trying to do here. So absolutely, that is what we're doing. Julia. I'm trying to go a little quickly now because I see there's a bunch of questions and we only got about 7 minutes.
I think you've answered, Roger, quite a lot of what I was thinking about, which was when, this inspired not the quest for truth, but the quest for meaning. And I was going to ask you more about the meaning of meaning, really, because I thought in my work, I sit seeing people all day long. As a business psychologist, I thought you could actually say that on my door. Yeah, I get some Eichmann-like character comes in, and we, in my world, we call it normotic disorders, an excessive normality gone off the shallow end kind of thing. And I wondered about Hannah Arendt and psychoanalysis, because there seems to be so many threads that are so in common, because a really good analytic experience is about the attempt to think about meaning.
Yeah.
If I've got a guy, for example, a San Fran rich guy, and he's just acting non-stop. And we spend most of our time talking about, well, why? What is this to you? What is this about? What are you thinking about? And then you get to the stories about how brutal his mother was with him, and then consequently how brutal he is with women. And I'm curious about Hannah Arendt and thinking with psychoanalysis, or whether she rejected it. I don't know. I've got Julia Kristeva's book on Hannah Arendt, but I haven't read it yet.
So it's a great question. I mean, Hannah Arendt is pretty skeptical of psychoanalysis, but, and it's a big but here.
Yeah.
It's largely because she worries. I mean, again, most of what she knows of psychoanalysis, she knows from Freud. She's worries that someone like Freud is too committed to making psychoanalysis a science.
Okay. Yeah.
And so if you understood what I've said so far,
Yeah.
and we'll keep going into it, she's worried that psychoanalysis tries to argue that the psyche can be penetrated and truths can be found. And that's her big worry with psychoanalysis. One of her best students and closest collaborators, and the woman who wrote, I think, still the best biography of her, Elizabeth Young Brule, was a psychoanalyst.
Okay.
And she knows that Arendt was critical of psychoanalysis, but obviously I don't think that interfered with their understanding of each other, because that's where she was critical of it. But yes, to the extent that you have a more existential psychoanalysis, or one that's not aimed at finding the truth or the science of
the issue.
Yeah. But that opens up questions and depths, then I think again, Arendt never confronted that, so I don't, but I think she would be more open to it if I had to guess.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try and get at least these in. Jeff.
Hi, Roger. Yeah, this is a pretty direct, simple question, but it relates to Kant. I wanted to reading this again. It just really strikes me that what she's talking about is what Kant calls reflective judgment, in opposition to regulative judgment, where you apply rules that exist. So in the reflective judgment, it's the thinker's job to figure out what rules there are. They might have to invent them, right?
One of the things that we're going to have to both be aware of and also engage in, right, is that as so often in her work, Arendt is making distinctions, and those distinctions are meaningful and useful for her, and yet they can never be absolute, right? And so this distinction between thinking, willing, and judging is one of those. And on the one hand, Arendt is going to try and talk about thinking and then talk about willing and then talk about judging. And yet they're obviously going to bleed into each other. And Jeff is not the first person. I mean, John also did, and others are pushing us to sort of bring judgment into thinking. And that's great. Reflective judgment, which is a core Kantian idea of judgment, is something that Arendt will talk about in her lectures on judgment, and probably would have come into this book on judgment. And where the line between thinking and judgment is very difficult, if not impossible, to make. And yet, insofar as we're talking here about thinking, we're not talking about making a judgment. We're simply talking about what is the activity of thinking itself before we make a judgment. And that's not to say that reflective judgment is not important for Arendt. It is, and I think you're right. I just want to say that we're really trying to focus on thinking here as an activity even before we make the judgment, and that's what we're going to focus on. Does that make sense, Jeff?
I get, well, I can't figure it out, but that seems like you did hit my question. So thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully, as we get through this section on thinking, you'll start to see, what, I mean, it is a strange idea because we think of thinking as leading to making a judgment, but she wants to separate them out. She wants to say that even before you make a judgment, simply the activity of thinking, driven by the pursuit not of truth, but of meaning, is meaningful and is important. All right, Max?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, my first time using Zoom. So I was thinking about a comment you made a little earlier referring to the concept of the moral imagination. And I was thinking about the instances where Arendt refers to Joseph Conrad or Franz Kafka in order to illustrate some of her points. And earlier when you're making trying to make the distinction between truth and meaning or fact and meaning, it kind of reminded me of, what all of our English teachers always talked about when saying, is fiction false? Are there truths in fiction that are different from the truths of science? So I'm wondering if conceptually that's a helpful way to kind of approach this, or if that's dumbing it down too much. And if so, then if the tools that we learned in those contexts, sort of a combination of an immersive interpretation, say, on the one hand, and then kind of a critical distance on the other, if those might be helpful moving.
No, I think it's important. You're going to see a lot of references to literature and poetry in this book. And I think for good reason, and for many of the reasons you said, that good literature generally seeks to pursue understanding and meaning and not truth. In fact, in Arendt's essay on Bertolt Brecht in Men in Dark Times, she says that to the extent Brecht's poetry and writing gets caught up in ideology, it ceases to be good poetry. It's only great poetry when it exceeds that claim of truth or truthfulness and actually explores things, in a wider way. And so great art, I think, is precisely as you put it, great because it eschews truth and seeks meaning and the meaning of what it means to be human, or usually. So yes, we will certainly come across many references to great art in this book, and it's worth pursuing. So that's great. All right. Thank you all. This is a great introduction, I hope. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did, hearing you to this book. It's a big book. It's complicated. We're going to read it slowly. I've really slowed down the pace at which we're reading it this time to give us a chance to read it carefully. I hope, again, some people follow along. Some people just want to hear us talk about it. That's great. But if you are reading it, give yourself the time. And enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next week. Thank